This is the read aloud for the LAC 2 Unit 2 test modified version. This portion of the read aloud will be for questions 1 through 8, coming from the unit content and the story after 20 years. Question 1. A technique authors use to give clues about or suggest what is going to happen is known as flashback, foreshadow, or suspense. Question 2. Read the excerpt from After 20 Years by O. Henry. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well nigh peopled the streets. Trying doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye adown the Pacific thoroughfare, the officer, with his stalwart form and slight swagger, made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter. The majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. Which statement best explains how the author's choice of setting affects the plot? It shows that Bob and Jimmy might not be able to meet because of inclement weather. It demonstrates O. Henry's deep understanding of what life is like in New York City. It explains why Bob does not recognize his friend Jimmy when he talks to the policeman. Please pause the recording and choose your answer to question 2. Question 3. 20 years ago tonight, said the man, I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum, and the finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York just like two brothers together. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning I was to start for the West to make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what our conditions might be, or from what distance we might have to come. We figured that in 20 years, each of us ought to have had our own destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be. Sounds pretty interesting, said the policeman. Rather a long time between meets, though, it seems to me. Haven't you heard from your friend since you left? Well, yes, for a time we corresponded, said the other. But a year or two we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around all over it pretty lively. But I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive, for he always was the truest, staunchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand in this door tonight, and it's worth it if my old partner turns up. The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. 3 minutes to 10, he announced. It was exactly 10 o'clock when we parted here at the restaurant door. What piece of textual evidence from After 20 Years, best supports the idea that Silky Bob has done well for himself in life? The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. I've had to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around over it pretty lively. Question 4. Read this excerpt from After 20 Years by O. Henry. About 20 minutes he waited. Then a small man in a long overcoat with collar turned up to his ears hurried across from the opposite side of the street. He went directly to the waiting man. Is that you, Bob? He asked doubtfully. Is that you, Jimmy Wells? Cried the man in the door. Bless my heart, exclaimed the new arrival, grasping both the other hands with his own. It's Bob, sure as fate. I was certain I'd find you here if you were. Well, well, 20 years is a long time. The old gone, Bob. I wish it had lasted. We could have had another dinner there. How has the West treated you, old man? Well, you've given me everything I asked for. You've changed lots, Jimmy. I never thought you were so tall by 2 or 3 inches. I grew a bit after I was 20. Doing well in New York, Jimmy? Moderately. I have a position in one of the city departments. Come on, Bob. We'll go to a place I know and have a good long talk about old times. The two men started up the street arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. Which statement best explains how the author's use of third-person narration affects the reader? It provides insight into both characters' thoughts, motivations, and actions. It allows for a plot twist, since the reader doesn't know either character's thoughts, or it makes the motivation of only one character clear to the reader. Question 5. Read the excerpt from After 20 Years by O. Henry. At the corner stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the west stopped suddenly and released his arm. "You're not Jimmy Wells," he snapped. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug. "It's sometimes changed a good man into a bad one," said the tall man. "You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. Chicago thinks you may have dropped out our way and wires us she wants to have a chat with you. Going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go to the station, here's a note I was asked to hand you. You may read it here at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells." The man from the west unfolded the little piece of paper handed him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was rather short. "Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plainclothes man to do the job. Jimmy." Why is this conversation the climax of the story? It is the most exciting part of the story because Bob becomes angry. The characters reach a turning point in the action when Bob is arrested. Or the reader learns what Jimmy looks like and that he is at the earlier meeting place. Question 6. How does the ending of the story function as a plot twist? An unexpected event takes place at the beginning of the story. A predictable event takes place at the end of the story. Or an unexpected event takes place at the end of the story. Question 7. Which statement best explains how the author's use of foreshadowing affects the story? It adds to the surprise created later when it's revealed that Jimmy did meet Silky Bob, and Bob is saying these words to Jimmy himself. It adds humor to the story, since readers, unlike Silky Bob, already know that he's speaking to Jimmy when he delivers the lines. Or it creates suspense by hinting at the fact that Silky Bob already knows that Jimmy will not show up to meet him. And question 8. How does O. Henry craft After 20 Years to create surprise? He presents information about both characters that is untrue. He gives little information about the policeman, so readers do not suspect him as Jimmy. Or he makes the setting dark and dreary to create an ominous mood. Please pause the recording, check your answers to questions 1 through 8. The next recorded read aloud will be for the cold read Secret in Slovakia, and it will cover questions 9 through 15.